By the time a military base is publicly described as under review, the decision that will ultimately determine its fate has often already been made. Bases are rarely abandoned because they suddenly become unusable or irrelevant. They are abandoned because they stop being treated as assets that must be preserved. The first thing that goes wrong at this stage is not infrastructure, staffing, or security, but intent. When intent shifts, everything else follows, even if the outward appearance of normal operations is maintained. Lights stay on, personnel remain assigned, and routine activity continues. Yet the base is no longer being prepared for a future in which it must perform at full capability. This shift in intent is rarely announced because doing so would force accountability and resistance. Instead, it is expressed indirectly through planning assumptions. The base is no longer included in long-term operational scenarios, contingency planning, or modernization roadmaps. It still appears in documents, but as a supporting location rather than a central one. Funding models change subtly, prioritizing sustainment over improvement. Maintenance budgets are calibrated to keep systems functional rather than resilient. These changes are easy to justify individually because the base is still operating, but together they redefine what the base is expected to be. Once a base is no longer expected to grow or adapt, redundancy becomes difficult to defend. Backup systems are preserved on paper, but not fully exercised. Equipment is kept running beyond its ideal service life because replacement would imply long-term commitment. Infrastructure upgrades are postponed because they would lock in future costs. Over time, the base becomes dependent on a narrower set of capabilities, increasing fragility while preserving the illusion of stability. The base still works, but only within a shrinking envelope of conditions. Administrative decisions reinforce this trajectory. Staffing models are adjusted to reflect reduced operational demand, leading to fewer specialists and more generalists. Training requirements are relaxed, not because standards are formally lowered, but because opportunities to train at full scale no longer exist. Personnel rotate through more quickly, limiting institutional memory and reducing incentives to invest deeply in systems that are not expected to endure. The base becomes a temporary assignment rather than a career-defining posting, and that perception shapes behavior long before any closure is announced. At higher levels, the base's value is increasingly framed in terms of what it prevents rather than what it enables. Its continued existence may deter rivals, reassure allies, or satisfy treaty obligations, even if its actual operational contribution is minimal. This symbolic utility allows decision-makers to justify keeping the base open without investing in its recovery. The base becomes a placeholder, useful as a concept, expendable as a capability. From the outside, it still counts. From the inside, it no longer matters in the way it once did. As time passes, this dual identity creates tension between reality and reporting. Performance metrics are adjusted to reflect reduced scope, making it easier to meet targets without restoring lost capability. Inspections focus on compliance rather than readiness. Problems are framed as manageable because expectations have been quietly lowered. This feedback loop reinforces the belief that the base is stable, even as its capacity to respond to disruption steadily erodes. The absence of crises becomes evidence that no intervention is needed. Logistically, the consequences of this decision accumulate slowly. Supply chains are optimized for minimum demand, reducing surge capacity. Contracts lapse without replacement because renewal would imply commitment. Cannibalization of equipment becomes routine, justified as efficient resource use. Each step makes sense in isolation, but together they dismantle the systems that would be required to reverse course. By the time concerns are raised, the mechanisms for recovery no longer exist in usable form. Strategically, this is the moment when abandonment becomes more likely than restoration, even if no one says so explicitly. The base's future is no longer debated in terms of potential, but in terms of cost avoidance. Questions shift from what would it take to fix this to is it worth fixing at all? Once that shift occurs, the outcome is largely determined. Any proposal to restore full capability must overcome not just technical challenges, but institutional momentum, moving in the opposite direction. As the base settles into its new role, the consequences of the intent shift begin to surface in subtle but compounding ways. Systems that once existed to provide depth and resilience are gradually reduced to single points of function. Power generation remains adequate under routine load, but lacks flexibility under stress. Communication systems continue to operate, but depend on aging hardware and limited redundancy. Environmental controls are maintained just well enough to avoid failure, not well enough to support surge activity. None of these compromises force immediate closure, but each one narrows the range of conditions under which the base can operate safely, quietly, transforming it from a robust installation into a fragile one. Decision-making adapts to this fragility without formally acknowledging it. Planners begin to avoid assigning the base demanding roles, not because it is incapable in absolute terms, but because reliance on it introduces uncertainty. This avoidance reduces operational exposure, which in turn reduces the likelihood that weaknesses will be revealed. The base appears stable precisely because it is no longer being tested. This self-reinforcing loop makes it increasingly difficult to argue for investment because the absence of visible failure is taken as evidence that the current approach is sufficient. If you find this kind of long-form analysis useful, subscribing helps the channel continue producing videos like this. Over time, administrative processes align with this reduced ambition. Oversight increases in areas related to risk and compliance, while decreasing in areas related to innovation and improvement. Projects that would restore capability stall in review cycles, while projects that formalize reduced scope move forward quickly. The base becomes governed by process rather than purpose, existing to meet administrative requirements rather than to deliver operational effect. This shift further distances the installation from its original mission and accelerates institutional disengagement. Externally, comparisons with newer or better supported facilities become unavoidable. When choices must be made about where to allocate resources, the placeholder base consistently ranks lower because its recovery path is uncertain and its future role ambiguous. Even modest investments elsewhere promise clearer returns. In this comparison, the base's history of gradual decline works against it, regardless of the reasons behind that decline. The longer the base remains in placeholder status, the harder it becomes to justify reversing course. Within the base, personnel adjust their expectations accordingly. Long-term planning gives way to short-term management. Skilled individuals seek assignments where their efforts will have visible impact, while those who remain focus on maintaining order and compliance. Institutional knowledge erodes as experienced staff depart and documentation lags behind reality. This loss of human capital is particularly damaging because expertise cannot be rapidly replaced, even if funding suddenly appears. The base's ability to recover is constrained not just by infrastructure, but by the disappearance of the people who understood how it once worked. As these dynamics converge, the cost of restoration grows faster than the perceived value of the outcome. Deferred maintenance accumulates, systems age beyond economical repair, and the gap between current capability and required capability widens. At some point, restoration proposals cease to be evaluated on their merits and are dismissed as unrealistic by default. The decision to abandon has effectively been made, even if it has not yet been acknowledged. Formal closure often arrives through an external trigger that allows leaders to act without revisiting the long sequence of internal choices that led there. Budget adjustments, strategic realignments, alliance commitments, or technological shifts provide the justification needed to formalize abandonment. The announcement frames closure as a response to new conditions, rather than as the culmination of a deliberate process. This framing preserves institutional credibility while masking the reality that the base's fate was sealed long before the trigger occurred. When the base is finally vacated, its physical condition can be misleading. Infrastructure may remain intact, utilities may still function intermittently, and equipment may still be present. To observers, this raises questions about why abandonment was necessary. What is not visible is the erosion of coherence that made recovery impractical. The lost redundancy, degraded systems, dispersed expertise, and absence of intent that together rendered the base unsalvageable. The base was not abandoned because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer worth restoring. Looking back, the pivotal moment is difficult to pinpoint. It is not the day funding was reduced, or the day a system failed, or the day closure was announced. It is the moment when the base stopped being treated as something that must have a future. Once that shift occurred, every subsequent decision reinforced the same trajectory, even if no one ever articulated the outcome. The base became a placeholder by design, and abandonment became the logical conclusion of that design. The broader lesson is that abandonment is rarely accidental. It is the product of deliberate choices made to manage risk, allocate resources, and avoid confrontation. These choices are often reasonable in isolation, yet collectively, they close off alternatives until only one remains. By the time abandonment becomes visible, it is no longer a decision to be debated, but a process that has already run its course.